welcome back to Pauline's Pop Culture Corner. I'm Pauline, and I'm excited to talk about my favorite scary Halloween movies in this video. My last video, we talked about some more family-friendly, cozy Halloween movies. The movies in this video are definitely not family-friendly, so keep that in mind when you're trying to pick a movie to watch with the kids. So if you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, ring the bell so that you know when a video is coming up, and follow me over at Instagram at Pauline's Pop Culture Corner. Love to see you there. Now let's get to the list. The first movie on the list is one of my all-time favorite scary movies, and it's the original Halloween, which came out in 1978. The story centers on Michael Myers from Haddonfield, Illinois. And at age 6 in 1963, he stabs to death his older sister, Judith, on Halloween night after she had a tryst with her boyfriend. That night, after everything happens, he's taken to Smith Grove Sanitarium where his doctor, Dr. Samuel Loomis, played by Donald Pleasance, watches over him for the next 15 years, where he says later Michael never even says a word. On the night before Halloween in 1978, Dr. Loomis and his nurse Marion Chambers are headed to Smith Grove Sanitarium to pick up Michael to take him to a hearing in another county where they have to see if he's able to be released. In that car ride, Dr. Loomis basically says that he never wants Michael to get out because to him, he knows Michael is evil and can never be rehabilitated. Once Dr. Loomis and Nurse Marion make it to Smith's Grove, they see that in the rain, all of the patients have been let out. So Dr. Loomis knows, oh my gosh, this is Michael. He gets out of the car, runs to the gate to try to make a phone call to warn the hospital of what's going on. When Michael jumps on top of the car, breaks in, chases Marion out of the car, and takes off in the car. Which, of course, most of us would think, well, how does he know how to drive? He's been in the hospital since he was 6. That comes up a little bit later when Dr. Loomis asks the same question of the doctors at the hospital. Dr. Loomis has a feeling he knows where Michael's going, and he gives chase on his way to Haddonfield, Illinois, because he figures that's where Michael's going. And on the way, he stumbles upon a tow truck and Michael's hospital gown, plus a matchbox that had been in the car the night before. So he takes off, not realizing that there's a body in the bushes, where Michael has killed the mechanic or tow truck driver from that truck and taken his coveralls, which brings us to part of Michael's iconic outfit, the coveralls that he always wears. Once Michael makes it to Haddonfield on Halloween morning, he goes to the old Myers house and presumably for the first time sees Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, as she leaves a key under the mat for her father, who is a real estate agent and is trying to sell the Myers house. He has clients coming by to see the house. This starts the day of Michael stalking Laurie, her friends, little Tommy Doyle, who she's going to be babysitting later on that day. As night falls, Michael makes his moves, killing his way through Laurie's friends as they are busy hooking up or trying to hook up in the case of Annie. Laurie fights back though, and Dr. Loomis, who's been tracking Michael all through the town with the sheriff, shows up and shoots Michael 6 times, and he falls off the balcony. Now, spoiler alert, when Dr. Loomis goes to look at the body over the balcony at the lawn, Michael's not there. I love the slow build of suspense, the way that Michael's lurking throughout the movie. You don't always see him. He's kind of in shadows. He'll just appear slowly out of a shadow, and all you see is his white mask. It's very unsettling to think that these characters are being stalked, and they don't really know they're being stalked, except for Laurie, who sees him a couple of times, but nobody else seems to see him when she sees him. The characters don't know they're in the crosshairs until the last minute. There's the desperation building in Dr. Loomis because as Michael's psychiatrist, he kind of has a feeling he knows what Michael can be capable of. And also the way that little Tommy is the one all night trying to sound the alarm because he sees Michael outside and just thinks of him as the boogeyman, but no one believes Tommy except for the other child in the movie, little Lindsay Wallace, who, for those of you who are Real Housewives fans, she is played by Kyle Richards, who is also Paris Hilton's aunt. A little bit of fun trivia. Halloween is basically the prototype for the slasher film of the 80s that became copied all through the decade. It was written by John Carpenter and Deborah Hill and then directed by Carpenter. And it, in my opinion, it was one of the best of the genre. You know, you could make the argument that because it was the first, it was the best, but I think it just has a certain quality to it that a lot of the other ones lack. There are a ton of sequels to Halloween, including, you know, up until just a couple weeks ago, the latest Halloween Kills came out. But to me, while there are some good sequels, the first is always going to be the best. The second movie on my list is Friday the 13th, and it came out in 1980, and it takes place at Camp Crystal Lake, which you can see the shirt, Camp Crystal Lake Counselor, right? Anyways, according to Sean Cunningham, who was the director producer of the movie, he admits it was a ripoff of Carpenter's Halloween, set at the summer camp in New Jersey, and it followed a similar formula to Halloween of promiscuous teens, lack of adult supervision, and a final girl survivor. In Halloween, it was Laurie. There was a certain charm to the backstory of Friday the 13th, though. And the fact that you don't see the killer until the end of the movie. Just all you see are the deaths that happen around the characters. They don't even know what's going on really until the end of the movie. It allowed for a buildup of suspense, wondering who the killer is and where they're going to strike next. The movie starts in the 1950s with some camp counselors and kids at a sing-along, and two of the counselors decide to leave and go fool around. They're followed and they're killed by an unseen killer. After that, the camp is closed down. The next scene takes place in 1980 when the camp cook that Steve Christie hired for the camp reopening, her name is Annie, she shows up in the little town and is looking for a ride to the camp. She's given a ride by a local trucker, but she's also warned that some terrible things had happened at the camp and she probably shouldn't go. The trucker's only able to take her part way, so she ends up getting a ride for the rest of the journey from an unseen driver. While she's in the car, she gets a little bit scared when she realizes that the driver has passed the turn for the camp. And the driver won't turn around or stop, so she ends up jumping from the car. And of course, the unseen killer runs and chases after her and ends up killing her in the woods. After Annie's death, we're introduced to the rest of the counselors and also Steve Christie, who's the owner of the camp. The most important person that we're introduced to is Alice. There are now, the cliche events of, the counselors running off and hooking up, running off by themselves, and the crazy, town local, in this case Ralph, coming and telling them that they're all doomed if they stay at the camp. Everyone's killed off one by one, and while Alice starts to wonder where everyone is and if something's wrong, it isn't until near the end of the movie, when the others have been killed off, that she starts to know that anything is for sure wrong or starts to even see any of the bodies. And that's also similar to Laurie in Halloween. This is when she sees someone pull up into the drive of the camp and she thinks that they're there to help. She runs out to them, and it turns out to be the old camp cook, Mrs. Voorhees. Mrs. Voorhees had a son when she worked at the camp named Jason, who was intellectually and physically disabled. He drowned because two of the counselors were too busy getting busy to watch him, and Mrs. Voorhees became vengeance for her son Jason. And those of you who are confused, yes, Mrs. Voorhees was the original Friday the 13th killer, not Jason. She and Alice fight all over the camp, and finally, after I don't even know how long, a really long time, Alice finally gets the upper hand and ends up decapitating Alice with her machete. The next scene is Alice floating peacefully in a canoe in the lake while there's peaceful music swelling, and then all of a sudden, Jason comes and he grabs her by the neck and pulls her into the lake. And then right after that, we hear screaming and Alice is in the hospital. So that tells us that that peaceful, idyllic floating in the lake was just one of Alice's dreams. But Alice is convinced that Jason is still out there, which is the perfect setup for all of the sequels that come next, where Jason actually is the killer. The next movie on the list rounds out what I call the big three of the 80s slasher films, and all three led to franchises. This one is A Nightmare on Elm Street. It came out in 1984 and introduced us to probably the quippiest of the slasher killers. He's actually, of the big three, the only one who actually talks, and his name is Freddy Krueger. The beginning of the movie starts with a young girl named Tina who is having a nightmare about a deformed man with finger knives who is chasing her down an alleyway. The next day at school, she's talking with her friends Nancy, Heather Langenkamp, and Glenn, who's a young Johnny Depp in one of his first roles. And it seems that some of the others may have been having nightmares as well. Her jerk boyfriend Rod shows up though before she can really figure out what's going on with that, and they all have to go into the school. That night, Tina, Heather, and Glenn are all at Tina's house because Tina's mom is out of town. Heather and Glenn are going to stay over to make her feel a little bit better about being alone because of her nightmares. All of a sudden, when they're in the living room, they start hearing crazy noises in the backyard, and they go to check it out. Glenn, in typical 80s, macho fashion, is the one that walks out into the backyard, and he actually is tackled by Rod, who has a garden tool that he was scratching on the wall, making the same sounds that Freddie was making in Tina's nightmare the night before. They are a little bit irritated with Rod, but they all do end up going into the house. And later on that night, Tina ends up having another Freddie nightmare. So in the nightmare, she's again being attacked and chased by Freddie. In the real world, Rod sees her being attacked by an unknown force. He can't see anything that's there, but she's being ripped apart. She's being flung up on the walls, on the ceiling. There's blood everywhere. He tries to get to her. She is swung to hit him almost like a baseball bat hitting a baseball, and he flies into the corner. Finally, unfortunately, Tina's dead. And by the time that Glenn and Nancy break into the room, all they see is blood and Tina, no Rod, because Rod has jumped out the window, which makes him suspect number one, according to the police. As the audience, though, we all know it's Freddy Krueger. We're just waiting for the characters to catch on. Freddy Krueger, the deal is that he's able to kill kids in their dreams, and then that makes it to where they actually die in real life, and no one can tell what's going on. Finally, Nancy realizes that the only way to kill him is to bring him out of the dream into the real world when she actually falls asleep and has a Freddy nightmare and brings his hat with her. So that ends up being her plan. At the point that she executes her plan, she's the only one of the original teens that we were following that's still alive, both Rod and Glenn having been killed. And Glenn's death is a spectacular blood fest. For anyone who hasn't seen it, he literally gets sucked into his bed and then blood spews out of it in a huge fountain. It's a little bit crazy. While trying to figure out what's going on, Nancy actually asks her mother if she knows anything about Freddy Krueger. And it turns out that Freddy was a child killer who was let out of jail on a technicality. So a bunch of the parents in the neighborhood, Nancy's mom included, got together and they actually enacted some vigilante justice on Freddy Krueger by burning him alive, basically. And her mom actually kept in the furnace in their basement like his original finger knives and other things of his. And so, of course that makes Nancy upset because the parents after that never talked about him again. So the kids all forgot about him. So they had no idea who he was when he started coming around in their dreams. Nancy realizes that Freddy's back for revenge and trying to kill the kids of all those parents that acted so long ago. And so she puts her plan into motion to try and bring him into the real world. And when she does, the way she defeats him, at least in this movie, is to overcome her fear and take back the fear that had fed him. And so he disappears. The last scene of the movie is kind of like a soft shot scene, and Nancy's leaving the house in the morning to go to school, and she walks down her porch and ends up getting into a car with all her friends who are miraculously still alive. And it's a convertible, and as they go to drive away, the convertible top comes up and you see that it's the red and green stripes of Freddy's sweater. So now the kids are actually trapped in a Freddy car. And as we look, the camera pans to her mother who's standing on the porch. Freddy's arm comes through the tiny little window on the front door and pulls her mother through. So that's how we know that actually was in fact a nightmare. This movie spawned a slew of sequels, some being good, others being awful, but none standing up to the original for sure, especially not the reboot. On paper, the next movie was just crazy. It was bonkers. It's the movie Child's Play that came out in 1988, and it's about, put simply, a killer doll, which was enough to scare a bunch of us who already were not too happy with those lifelike dolls that they kept coming out with. On a dark night on the south side of Chicago, a criminal named Charles Lee Ray, who was a serial killer, was being chased by a Detective Mike Norris. Now, Charles Lee Ray was played by Brad Dourif, and the detective was played by Chris Sarandon. Now, the detectives, he chased Charles Lee Ray into a toy store and ended up shooting him. Before he could die, Ray ended up reaching out and putting his hand on the forehead of a good guy doll who kind of looked a lot like My Buddy from the 80s. And he did a voodoo rite which transferred his soul into the doll, leaving his own body lifeless. Because of this, the police thought he was dead. Meanwhile, a widow named Karen Barkley, played by Catherine Hicks, purchased the doll from a peddler because it was kind of one of those things like, if you remember at all the craze of Cabbage Patch dolls or Tickle Me Elmo and how hard or expensive it was to get one of those, it was kind of supposed to be the same deal with good guy dolls. So anyway, she buys this doll from the peddler out in an alley without knowing where he got it from. That night, her friend Maggie is watching Andy back at the apartment when suddenly she's hit in the face with a hammer and thrown out the window. When the police come, they question Andy, who starts to say that it was Chucky who did it. Of course, they don't believe him. They're not going to believe that a doll murdered someone. After this incident, Chucky starts encouraging Andy to do things that help him, like skipping school and taking him over to his criminal partner's house, where he ends up murdering the man. Of course, Andy tells everyone that it was Chucky's fault, but nobody believes him. This causes Andy to be put into a psychiatric hospital. That night, Karen goes to move the box that the doll came in, and the batteries fall out. This makes her realize that the doll's been moving and talking and doing all of these things without batteries. She picks up the doll and starts shaking it, telling it that she's going to throw it in the fire if it doesn't start talking. So Chucky comes to life, bites her, and then runs off. Karen goes to the police station to talk to the Detective Norris, and of course he doesn't believe her. He insists he killed Charles Lee Ray. There's no way that... What do you mean? Charles Lee Ray isn't a doll? However, when he takes her home, he actually becomes the one that's attacked by Chucky. So, of course, now he believes. He shoots Chucky, who strangely starts to bleed. This is a new development. Now, Chucky escapes and goes and talks with the man, John, who is his mentor for when he was learning voodoo. John explains that the more time that he spends in the doll's body, the more human it will become and he'll be trapped. So he needs to go and put his soul into the body of the first person who he revealed himself to, which would be Andy. He goes off to the hospital to try to find Andy, but Andy escapes and runs back home. When he gets there, Karen's able to throw him into the fireplace and Andy lights him on fire. Chucky escapes the fireplace all charred and burnt up, and Karen shoots him repeatedly as Mike is trying to stop his own bleeding from a severe cut on his leg from Chucky. Detective Norris's partner, Jack, shows up and doesn't believe that it's Chucky, of course. Chucky escapes the fireplace and pops out later through a vent and actually kills Jack, leading Detective Norris to finally shoot him in the heart and kill him. This movie was considered a straight-up horror movie when it was first released, but subsequent sequels kind of took it into a more campy and cheesy direction, with it becoming full-on horror comedy later on with movies like Bride of Chucky. Now, there's been numerous remakes and other movies since the movie came out, and there's actually a new show coming out. I believe it is called just Chucky, where he's with a teenage boy and kind of the same things play out. So we'll see. Maybe we'll check it out. Not sure if it'll be a good watch, but I'm willing to give it a try. The next movie on my list is The Pit and the Pendulum. It came out in 1961, and it's based on Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Pit and the Pendulum, and it stars Vincent Price as Nicholas Medina. The year is 1547, and the place is a castle in Spain. An Englishman named Francis Bernard is visiting the castle, as it's where his sister Elizabeth lived with her husband, Nicholas Medina. Medina is played by Vincent Price, and Bernard is visiting to investigate his sister's untimely death. When Bernard asks Medina and his sister Catherine what happened, to Elizabeth, he was vaguely told she died of a blood disorder some 6 months before. He vows not to leave until he has answers. One night at dinner, Dr. Leon tells Bernard that she died of fright, literally having a massive heart attack. He demands that Medina take him to where it happened, and he's led to the castle's torture chamber. Medina states that the oppressive nature of the castle weighed down on Elizabeth until she became obsessed with the torture chamber. He found her locked in the Iron Maiden, where she whispered the name Sebastian before she died. Francis asks Catherine about why Medina seems to feel guilt over what happened to Elizabeth if she locked herself in the Iron Maiden. And he is told by Catherine that their father was Sebastian Medina, an agent of the Spanish Inquisition, and that Medina's childhood was traumatic. As a young boy, he had snuck into the chamber and witnessed his father kill his uncle and his mother after accusing them of having an affair. Medina believes that Elizabeth is now a vengeful spirit wandering the castle. They open her crypt and see that, as the doctor suggested, she must have been buried alive because there was evidence of her trying to claw her way out. That night, she chases Medina into the torture chamber, where he falls down the stairs. And we see Dr. Leon emerge from the shadows as he's been working with Elizabeth, who's not dead, to drive her husband insane so that she and Leon could inherit the castle and his wealth and be together forever. Leon determines that, yes, Medina is now insane, and Medina begins to laugh maniacally and believes himself, after hitting his head, to be his father, Sebastian Medina. And so he starts to behave accordingly, acting out the murders of his wife and brother from years before that Nicholas Medina had witnessed. After he kills Leon by pushing him into the pit and locking Elizabeth into the Iron Maiden, Bernard shows up and is also mistaken for the uncle, straps him onto a stone slab below a razor-sharp pendulum. And as the pendulum lowers slowly over Bernard as it swings to and fro, Catherine and a servant Maximilian show up and they struggle with Nicholas Medina, pushing him into the pit. As they free Bernard, they leave the room and close the door, saying that no one will ever enter that room again. The last shot is of Elizabeth still alive, locked in that Iron Maiden, a victim of her own cruel plan. This movie is wonderful in its suspense. Vincent Price playing both Nicholas Medina and Sebastian Medina is wonderful. His ability to turn from a haunted, grieving man to a vengeful, torturous man is just terrific. He's always been one of my favorite actors. This next movie is considered to be a masterpiece, even though the author of the book it's based on does not like it. I'm talking about The Shining, which was released in 1980 and directed by the great Stanley Kubrick. Based on a novel by Stephen King of the same name, the movie stars Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall and is considered a classic horror movie. This is the story of a deeply flawed author and his very dysfunctional family, his wife Wendy and his young son Danny. Danny's a very young boy who has a special insight that is revealed throughout the movie, and Wendy is a slightly hysterical personality. Jack applies and is hired at a remote hotel in the Colorado mountains called the Overlook as their winter caretaker. Jack is to move his family to the hotel, and they would be the only ones there to take care of the hotel while it's closed for the winter. He is warned that there was a previous caretaker who basically went stir crazy and ended up killing his whole family, including his twin daughters. As the winter bears down on the Torrance family, Jack's sanity deteriorates due to some supernatural forces in the hotel pushing him and pulling him. He finally snaps and tries to kill Wendy and Danny and succeeds in killing the cook who came all the way from Florida to check on them because he sensed through the shining that he shares with Danny, that sixth sense, that all was not well. Danny and Wendy are both able to escape Jack due to Danny's cunning in a hedge maze that leaves Jack out in the cold to freeze to death. This movie is so nuanced and detailed and has been analyzed through the years. Kubrick was famously a perfectionist and required many takes to get things right until he was satisfied. This included so many takes of Shelley Duvall in a physically and emotionally draining scene on the stairs with Jack Nicholson, where they were arguing and she was trying to keep him away from her using a baseball bat. Many people believe that the numerous amount of takes and the torture on the set from Kubrick to Duvall to try and get the performance out of her that he wanted left her mentally and emotionally scarred for the rest of her life. Strangely, there are some inconsistencies that are seen in the movie that don't match Stanley Kubrick's attention to detail. Some of these are furniture not being in the right place in the same scene from different angles, as well as who let Jack out of the locked pantry towards the end of the movie. I have recently watched a video here on YouTube that puts a different theory out on who exactly was going insane in that family. I have to say it was definitely an eye-opener and made a lot of sense. I warn you though, only watch it if you're okay with your perspective on the movie being changed. It's on a channel called Rob Navarro and it's called The Wendy Theory. The link is in the description. So by now, we all know the story of Dracula. An aristocratic foreign count arrives in England from Transylvania and wreaks havoc among the maidens of our story and the men trying to save them. For me, Bram Stoker's Dracula that came out in 1992 and directed by Francis Ford Coppola is probably the closest movie adaptation that we have to the book. It sticks closely to Bram Stoker's story while also adding a little bit more of backstory to Dracula and why he ended up becoming the way he was and giving him a little bit of a love story. The movie starts with Vlad Tepes Dracula, played by Gary Oldman, returning to his castle in Transylvania in 1462 after a battle, and finding out that his wife Elisabetta, played by Winona Ryder, who later also plays Mina, has killed herself after the enemy informed her that he had died in battle. The priest says that her soul is forfeit and that she will not enter heaven because she was a suicide. Dracula goes crazy, denouncing God, wondering why this happened. If he had, been off fighting these wars in the name of God, how could God let this happen to him? And he trashes the chapel and ends up stabbing the giant cross where blood gushes out. And as the blood gushes out, he takes a chalice and drinks it, and thus becomes a creature of the night. We fast forward to 1897 and a solicitor named Jonathan Harker, who's played by Keanu Reeves. He's preparing to head to Dracula's castle in Transylvania to be his solicitor for his relocation to London. He says goodbye to his fiancée Mina and promises to marry her upon his return. Mina decides to stay with her wealthy friend Lucy Westenra. When Jonathan arrives in Romania, he's warned by the locals not to go to the castle, that it's not safe. But being that it's his duty as the solicitor, he ignores all of these good warnings. When he arrives, he meets an old and decrepit-looking count, and it slowly becomes clear that he's a prisoner and will need to escape. Before he can escape, the Count actually leaves for London with all of these crates full of his home earth, which we know from tradition is so that he can sleep in his home earth and gain strength from that. He crosses over to England on a ship, and when the ship, devoid of people, ends up beaching itself, a giant wolf, who we know is Dracula, jumps out of the ship and makes his way to Carfax Abbey, leaving his crates to be delivered there later. Very soon, Mina's friend Lucy, played by Sadie Frost, starts deteriorating. This causes her suitors, Quincy Morris, Dr. Seward, and her fiancé Arthur Holmwood, great concern. Dr. Seward sends for his mentor, Dr. Van Helsing, played by Sir Anthony Hopkins. He determines that it is a vampire working against them, and although their efforts are valiant, they're unable to save Lucy. In the meantime, Dracula, having grown young, finds Mina and starts to try to woo her. Before he can get very far with her, though, word comes from Jonathan, who has escaped the castle, for her to join him in Romania. She joins him and they're married at a monastery there. When the Harkers return to London, Dracula visits Mina at Dr. Seward's sanitarium, and he admits he's the one who killed Lucy and who has been terrorizing the men. She is confused, and she admits remembering her life with him as Elisabetta. At her urging, he starts the process to transform her into a vampire through blood transfer. They're interrupted by the men, however, and the process doesn't finish. It could actually be argued that she was not in her right mind at the time. After Dracula is driven out by the group of men, Van Helsing hypnotizes Mina and finds out that she has a psychic connection to him, which they use to track him. He's actually on a ship headed back to his castle in Transylvania. The group gives chase, as they now know that the only way to save Mina's soul is to kill Dracula, and he'd be virtually unkillable in his homeland, on his home turf. When they reach him, there is a huge fight in which Dracula is gravely injured by Jonathan. He and Mina retreat to the chapel where he lays in his demonic form. He asks for peace, and Mina plunges a knife through his heart, and he grows young. She then decapitates him, and as she does so, the mark of a communion wafer that was pressed to her forehead disappears, showing she is no longer sullied. Her gaze lingers on a mural of Dracula and his beloved Elisabetta ascending into heaven, which is how it should have been centuries before. This movie has it all for me. A brilliant story in Dracula, which if you haven't read the book, you really should. It has terrific actors, action, a love story, revenge. It's always been one of my favorites. Okay, now we're going to talk about a movie that has affected so many people. The Exorcist. It came out in 1973, and it's a masterful film. It's based on a book by William Peter Blatty, and it's directed by Billy Friedkin. It's the story of a young girl named Regan, played by Linda Blair, who's possessed by a demon. Her mother, Chris McNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, is an actor who is on location in Georgetown making a film. The movie starts off at an archaeological dig in Iraq with Father Marin, who's played by Max von Sydow, a priest and archaeologist. This suggests that whatever possesses Regan later in the movie comes from this dig. The movie starts off with some unsettling things happening in the home. Regan acting out of character, not like herself. Finally, Chris seeks some help from the Catholic Church, thinking that it's possession. She talks to Father Damien Karras, who also happens to be a psychiatrist, and he's skeptical that this is demon possession. It's not an everyday thing in the Catholic Church, no matter what people think, for there to be exorcisms going on. He soon realizes, however, that in this situation he's in over his head and doesn't really know how to help or what to do. So he calls in Father Marin, who actually has some experience with exorcisms. As they go through the process, all of the things that are happening are well known by now. We look at them and we're like, oh yeah, the rotating head and the levitating and the projectile vomiting. Well, back in 1973, they hadn't seen movies with this kind of stuff, and it genuinely freaked people out to the point that people passed out, they vomited, they ran screaming from the theater. There were people who thought that they would end up getting possessed just by watching the movie. It was crazy. Now, eventually, during the process, Father Marin dies because his body just couldn't take the stress anymore. Father Damien demands that the demon take him instead of Regan, and when the demon enters his body, he actually throws himself head first out of a window and down this huge stone flight of stairs outside. At the bottom, he's lying broken when his friend, Father Dyer, who is actually played by a real priest named William O'Malley, shows up and gives him the last rites. The last scene is of Regan and her mother Chris leaving the home, presumably either the film is done or she just said, forget it, I'm not staying here anymore. And they get into a car and they drive off. And you think, oh, that's nice. The evil's been defeated. Happy ending. No, they're sequels. And they're not as good as the original. They're not as suspenseful, but they are worth a watch for sure. So this movie is not just a movie. It's a couple of different versions of a movie that I wanted to add in here. And it's the second movie or story on the list based on a book by Stephen King, and that's It. Both the 1990 mini-series version and the two movies that have come out in the last few years. So, if you haven't, this is one of the times where I'm going to tell you, if you haven't read the book It, you've only through the movies gotten like half of the story. It's hard to say that you know what the story is about if you haven't also read the book. As great as the movies are, the book is so much more information. This is the story of how there is something rotten in the town of Derry, Maine. From missing kids to murders, bullies that go too far, adults that look the other way and turn a blind eye. It is clear that there's a poison in the town. And the poison is it. Pennywise the clown is an evil entity that awakes every 27 years to feed off the fear and the flesh of mostly children in the town of Derry. There's a group of 12-year-olds called the Losers Club that realize that they're the only ones that know what's going on in the town. And due to being stronger together than they are separately, they know that if they band together, they can take it down. The first movie version, like I said, was a miniseries. The second version was a 2-part movie. So I can't go into details. It's just too long, too much information for this video. But if you haven't watched the movies, definitely go watch them. Both versions have some great acting. Tim Curry is Pennywise in the original. We've got Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise in the new version. Both of them do an excellent job. I really do recommend watching it. The last movie on the list is called Trick or Treat. And it came out in 2007, and it's different from the other movies on the list because it's an anthology movie. So basically, it's a lot of different stories all occurring on the same night, Halloween, in a town that is having a big parade and festival. And at first, they seem all separate, like they have nothing to do with each other other than their location all being in the same town. But by the end, a lot of them end up tying back together, which is kind of neat to see how they come together. So the things that happen in the movie is, there's like straight up murder with a psycho school principal and his son. There's kids playing jokes on the wrong person. There's vampires, there's werewolves, and other things that go bump in the night. The most recognizable actor is Anna Paquin, who plays Little Red Riding Hood, but there are some character actors that you definitely will watch and be like, hey, I know him, what's he from? And then you'll end up on IMDb trying to figure it out. There is quite a bit of gore, but the storytelling is really good. It kind of reminds me of almost like a urban legends type story or movie with all of the different myths and things, but Halloween themed. And then, of course, there's Little Sam that ties the whole thing together. So that's my list for horror movies this year. Not really in a particular order except for the top 3. There were so many more that I wanted to discuss, but I just ran out of time. So they'll have to be on the list for next year. I just love scary movies. The classics, the new ones, cheesy, campy, masterpieces. They're all great. If you liked the video, make sure you subscribe, like, and go ahead and ring the bell so that you're notified whenever I post. Also, come follow me over on Instagram at Pauline's Pop Culture Corner. And don't forget to @ me with your Halloween costumes this year. Can't wait to see them. All right, all you ghouls, ghosts, and goblins, make sure you have a happy, spooky, and safe Halloween.